Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenidos. Welcome. My name is Bianca Castellanos, and I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study and a distinguished McKnight University professor of American Studies. For access purposes, I'm a brown-skinned woman wearing black frame glasses and a black jacket and a teal t-shirt. And I actually want to show what my t-shirt says. It says, I'm Mexican, and this is, what's your superpower? I thought it would be very appropriate for today's event. The University of Minnesota Injustice Series brings together scholars, artists, and community leaders to discuss the most pressing issues of our time. Over the next 2 years, our featured guests will share how they approach today's problems, explore their own visions for what justice might look like, and together we'll gain a deeper understanding of how to build a better future and a more just world. We're very excited to welcome you to our last Injustice event of the semester, El Rinche and the History of Land Theft, Lynching, and Resistance. We're also very grateful to the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, our financial co-sponsor for today's conversation, as well as the many promotional sponsors who've been recognized in our slideshow for helping us to welcome campus and community together today. All IAS public events, including this one, include professional captioning. You can view captions by clicking the Stream Text link shared via the chat, or by clicking the Show Captions button in Zoom's menu. We'll begin by using Slido to facilitate our audience Q&A today. When it's time for Q&A, we'll display a QR code on the screen. Alternatively, you can use your smartphone or go to www.slido.com and enter the code #IAS. Please note that questions can be submitted anonymously, and that in order to respond to as many questions as possible, we may occasionally combine related questions. My next step in welcoming you today is to remind us that wherever you are joining us from today, we're all on native land. I am speaking from the ancestral and contemporary lands of Dakota people. I would also like to remind us that the University of Minnesota was not only built on unceded Dakota land, but built with the profits from selling thousands of acres of Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. Today's event is in conversation with this history of land grabs. At the IES, we see the work of supporting communities of color as inseparable from supporting our Indigenous relatives and colleagues. Toward that end, it's important to acknowledge and denounce the historic and contemporary forms of racial injustice in the city where we work as well. So I begin by standing in solidarity with the families of George Floyd, Dante Wright, Jamar Clark, and Philando Castile, whose loved ones have been killed by police violence in Minnesota. As a scholar whose work critically examines racial injustice, I acknowledge and affirm the sovereignty of our Indigenous relatives while advancing the IS's commitment to building an anti-racist and inclusive university that disavows white supremacy and racism. As you join us at future Injustice events, I hope you'll see how these conversations act as just one way we've committed to working alongside our relatives to dismantling the systems that harm our communities and to building a just university together. And now, without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce today's guests. Our moderator for today is Jessica Lopez-Lyman. She is an interdisciplinary performance artist and Chicana feminist scholar interested in how Indigenous and people of color create alternative spaces to heal and imagine new worlds. Jessica has published both poetry and scholarship. Her manuscript, called Midwest Mujeres, Chicana Latina Art and Performance, explores racialized and gender geographies of urban Minnesota. She built La Luchadora, a mobile screen printing cart, and prints political posters with communities across the state. Jessica is an assistant professor in the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Our featured guest is Christopher Carmona. He's the author of the young adult novel series El Rinche, the Ghost Ranger of the Rio Grande. The first in the series was a finalist for the 2019 Best Young Adult Novel by the Texas Institute of Letters. Earlier this year, Carmona published Chispas, a collection of poems about identity, love, and injustice. As an educational activist, Carmona serves on the board of Refusing to Forget, an award-winning educational nonprofit that builds awareness of state-sanctioned anti-Mexican violence in the Texas-Mexico border that took place from 1910 to 1920. His work also includes implementing Mexican-American studies and PreK-12 education in Texas. He was a leader in getting the TEKS-based Mexican-American Studies high school course approved by the Texas State Board of Education, which is the only state board-approved Mexican-American Studies course in the United States to date. So thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in giving them a very warm welcome. So Christopher, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you guys for having me here. I'm very excited to be talking to you guys in the Midwest. This is my first trip out this way. And as I was told, I came on a good day when it's not 20 degrees. But today I'm going to be talking about a history that is very personal to me in a lot of different ways, and also a very undertold history of this country. Is not just about the borderlands of Texas and Mexico, but it really is a U.S. history and an international history in a lot of ways. But so let's go ahead and start by talking about the organization that Biana just discussed, called Refusing to Forget. So Refusing to Forget is a project that originally started 10 years ago when a group of scholars came together to do a panel at the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies Conference about the violence that happened here over 100 years ago now in the Texas-Mexico border. But since then, it's grown, and since we've done many talks all over the country, we've engaged with lots of different groups, and it's expanded not just to referring to this initial time, which we're going to be talking about today, which is referred to as La Matanza, to really looking at state-sanctioned violence against Latinos up until today. Even dealing with something like we were deeply involved in the Uvalde community and what happened in Uvalde 2 years ago, as well as what happened with the Border Patrol incident with the Haitian immigrants. If you guys saw the pictures that were on CNN last year. All that stuff is stuff that we've become involved in because when we talk about violence and state-sponsored violence, like when we're talking about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and Philando Castile and all these are all connected to the same topic, right? This type of police violence that has been sanctioned either inadvertently or really. In the case that we're talking about here, what happened at the beginning of the 20th century, it was sanctioned legally by the state of Texas during this time. But so this group is one group that I've been a part of for quite a while now. And I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of where we come from. But the time I'm talking about is really also talking about a very specific police force called the Texas Rangers. All right. And so this is my grandfather. That's the youngest picture I've ever found of him. So I grew up on the Texas-Mexico border, a little town called Donna, and I literally lived about 5 miles from the river, from the Rio Grande River. So in that area, when my grandfather lived during this time, and so when I was growing up, I heard these stories about the Texas Rangers. But it really wasn't until I got older that I realized the importance of these stories, because the way I was doing a conference years ago, and I was talking with a friend of mine who was also from the same area I'm from, and we were talking about the Texas Rangers because the Texas Rangers, where we're from, down in South Texas, or many Mexican American communities in Texas, refer to them as Rinches. And Rinches is a term that actually comes from Los Pinches Rinches. That's the way my grandfather referred to them. My dad would call them Rinches. So, but that's the actual, what they call them, because for a lot of people, especially Mexican Americans, people of color in Texas, they were basically the KKK of Texas. Most people don't know this because most people know about Texas Rangers is the Lone Ranger and Walker Texas Ranger, right? And the image that's given off usually, and they're portrayed in movies and different things as heroes, right? But in reality, they weren't. For a lot of people, they weren't, especially during the time we're talking about at the turn of the century. And so what happened for me personally is that during this time, from about 1910 to 1920 is the term that is referred to as La Matanza. It's where upwards of thousands of Mexican Americans were murdered, lynched, and had their land stolen. The Texas Ranger were an instrument. They were an instrument of American corporations and the Anglo ranchers that were surrounding the communities that wanted to take these lands from them. So during this time, the violence got so bad that my great-grandfather had to take his family into Mexico in the middle of the Mexican Revolution because it was safer than staying on this side of the border. And so that's how our family, we lost lands because of this. We lost, and a good friend of mine, which is also one of the founding members, Trinidad Gonzalez, his grandfather was killed by the Texas Rangers during this time. So it's a very personal history. And why, when people ask me why I got into this, is because it is part of my history, part of the history of the area I grew up in, but it has a whole lot of stuff here. So I usually start this with a quote by James Baldwin that kind of sums up how people kind of view a lot of this. So he wrote, it comes as a great shock around the age of 5, 6, or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance to, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to see Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, and although you're rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians are you. It has come as a great shock to discover that the country which is your birthplace and to which your life and identity has not in its whole system of reality ever evolved any place for you. So this is kind of the history, because as we start to represent how Mexicans are portrayed in film, in culture, and in all these Westerns, right? They're always the enemy, right? But I grew up on Westerns too. I grew up with watching this stuff. And this is the kind of schism that happens, right? We're rooting for these cowboys, but we are the Indians in these scenarios, right? So how do we kind of reconcile that? So that's why I always love this quote by Baldwin, because it kind of shows your relationship in this country. To kind of start the history of what we're looking at, most of what we now consider the United States of America was Spanish owned, and before that it was Indian land, right? But Spain like to claim everything for itself, right? And so they in order to maintain their control of everything all the way up to what is now Oregon, all the way out to what is past Louisiana and into south, obviously Mexico, they established what's the Spanish land grant system. And this is where 563 prominent families were gifted basically lands, millions of acres of lands all across this area, across the U.S. Or south, what is considered southwest. The area that I'm looking at in particular is this area right here, which, as you can see, goes all the way to Tampico and south of the Nueces River. That area right there is where most of the violence took place during this time here. This, the Nova Santander land grant in this area was really controlled by Mexican families. And for about 300 years, these lands in this area in particular were undesirable lands. That's what they were usually classified, first by Spain, then Mexico, and even the US. Because these were ranching lands. These are hard lands to live on. And so they just didn't really deal a lot with this, and they kind of left it to its own. Even after the Texas Revolution, this land was not really considered Texas. The Texas Revolution only wanted up to the Nueces River. So this was always contested lands. So because of that fact, these families were pretty much left to run themselves. They established their own school systems, they established their own cities, pretty much independent from Mexico City and from Washington in a lot of ways. And this is when we get to the end of the 19th century, though, we have something that occurs, right? So what happens during this is these Mexican families own a lot of these lands, but as time goes on, especially after the U.S.-Mexico War, when half of Mexico is taken for the United States, this shifts a lot of the. If we look at when I usually teach, like how would we teach like American literature, American history, most people ended after the Civil War, Well, if you actually look at it, it's actually 1845 is where the country shifts. Because it's 1845 when they inherit half of what is now the U.S., and that's what leads to a lot of things. And it builds up toward to the Civil War and even after that. But what's happening here is these lands are started to slowly be, because part of the deal of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the U.S.-Mexico War, was that the people living on these lands would become U.S. citizens, but they would be allowed to keep their lands. That was the treaty. But like anybody who's indigenous knows, the U.S. never wrote a treaty that they ever followed. And they spent the next 50 years taking lands from Mexicans from this whole time. The ones that were pretty much maintained, this is usually referred to as the last colonization of the U.S. mainland. This right here is what's considered the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And this is the last kind of map that you'll see here that details the last Spanish land grant owning areas. So what would happen is these Mexican families would intermarry, and as wedding presents, they would give them what's called porciones. Porciones are little portions of their land grant that they would give as wedding gifts, which is what this shows here. All those little strips right there are porciones that were given to these families here. Why that's important is to show you how much they kind of controlled these areas and who was in charge for a long time. So if we look at, this is what's usually referred to as the progressive era. This was a very violent time for people of color in this country. You have what happens here with the Matanza, which is the last lands that were taken, the burning and the destruction of black townships, black towns, freedom towns, the lynchings, the expulsion of Asian Americans with the Chinese Exclusion Act and everything that came with that. And of course, you have during this time the implementation of the reservation systems and the of what they would quote unquote the Indian Wars, right? So it was a lot of things that basically became about because of the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, the ending of Reconstruction kind of ends with Grant's presidency. And then after that, we get a huge shift because they call it the rise of the New South at that point, and the Confederates start to get back into power, and this is where Jim Crow is born. For Latinos, there's something referred to as Juan Crow, which was the same type of system that was broken down, worked with Mexicans instead. But during this time, this area in particular was targeted, especially from a few different American corporations. You might recognize some of the names like the American Fruit Corporation, which becomes involved in what happens in Dominican Republic and all these places. Well, they targeted this area because these lands were ripe for agriculture, yet they're being used for ranching. And so in 1905, the state of Texas issues the Rio Grande Land and Irrigation Company a grant to what we now consider terraform these lands from ranching to agriculture. Problem was, these Mexican families, Mexican-American families at this point, were not going to sell. They've had these lands in their families for 300 years. So these corporations go to the governor of Texas and say that they're having trouble getting these lands. So this is where the governor at the time basically tells them that you can use the Texas Rangers, which is at that time was basically a police force run by the governor's office, to do whatever you need to get done, and whatever they do, they will not be prosecuted. We found this in a letter to one of the Anglo ranchers a few years ago. So this was what happened, right? So they basically unleashed this force on the peoples here. And as you can see here from 1900 to 1910, 187,000 acres of land transferred from Tejano to Anglo hands in just 2 Texas counties, which are the ones down on the border, Cameron and Hidalgo. Many of those who lost their lands ended up working on it, paid not very well by its new owners. And during this time, sheriffs sold 3 times as many parcels of tax delinquency in that decade from 1904 to 1914 than they had from 1893 to 1903. These sales almost always transferred from Tejano to Anglo hands. And because records of land ownership in the region had been poorly maintained when the land was less desirable, Anglo settlers could often challenge ownership in court. And many times the courts were were bought by these corporations and by the Anglo ranchers. So this is what happens here. This is the go-ahead to unleash the Texas Rangers on them. And it really starts here with the railroad coming down, because before this, the railroad connected in 1904. They'd never had a railroad in this area before. And this is what brought what they call the second wave of Anglos into here. And all this kind of stuff started to shift. And a lot of this begins to happen. And I'm going to skip that one just to kind of go over here. But if you look at this one, this is probably one of the most famous photos during this time. There is a photographer by the name of Robert Runyon who was on the border during this time. He was trying to take a lot of photographs for real estate reasons, but he ended up taking a lot of the photographs and a lot of more lynching photographs because this is what was happening during the time. And so this is one of the most famous one, and this is staged, all right, to make it look like the Texas Rangers. And this is referred to, so this in particular was something called the Norias raid, where they raided this ranch and they killed, I think, upwards of 36, and they use the term a lot, bandits. So every time they killed someone, they referred to them as a bandit, and then it was okay. It's kind of like, a police officer fears for his life, so that's why he had to shoot them, right? And so this is what's happening during this time. But also what's happening during this time is the press stops covering the lynchings. The San Antonio Express-News, which at the time was the largest newspaper in Texas, wrote that the finding of dead bodies of Mexicans suspected of various reasons from being concerned with the Troubles, that's what they referred to it as, the Troubles, has reached a point where it creates little or no interest. It is only when a raid is reported or a white American is killed that the ire of the people is aroused. And so they stopped covering it. So when we start to look at how we do this research, a lot of it is oral history work. But there was one reporter who kept writing. Her name was Jovita Hidad. And Jovita Hidad actually is the first Mexican-American woman to be on the U.S. quarter. She just got on the quarter in September. And so she has gained a lot of fame, and she's actually in the novels that I wrote. But because she continued to write about the atrocities, she wrote against what the U.S. policies were. And there's a very famous Google Doodle with her standing, if you look up Jovita Hidad Google Doodle, it's the kind of the incident that made her famous. It's her standing in front of her presses with Texas Rangers who were ordered to burn down her presses, and she stops them. That's kind of the image that's there, and that becomes kind of a rallying cry for a lot of people. But Jovita Hidad was a highly educated woman, and she took on the Texas Rangers. She took on, and she continued to write a lot of these articles about what was happening. She was really the only one. And of course, most of her stuff was Spanish language newspapers like La Crónica and others, but she continued to write because it was not being covered. Right? So when we look at this era, there's not a lot of literature about this. So the first one that you got that is with this pistol in his hand by Americo Paredes. So this is kind of the novel that starts everything. It was made into a movie in the early 1980s with Edward James Olmos called The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. So I think you can probably find it online somewhere. So this is about a real guy, Gregorio Cortez, who ends up being involved in an incident where he has to flee, and he avoids the Texas Rangers. They never actually catch him. He actually turns himself in because they arrested his family, which is, illegal, but they did it anyway. But Americo Paredes in the 1950s wrote this book, which is the first book ever to challenge this myth of what the Texas Rangers were. And this was the only thing. So you have others like Shame the Stars by Guadalupe Garcia Macall and Balo's War. But I kind of stepped into this with my series because even though I do a lot of this kind of historical work, I'm also a writer. And I wanted to get these stories to younger audiences because I heard them directly from my grandfather, but my nephews, the younger generations, they don't have any connection to this. They're not in the history books as of yet. We're working to get these into the history books. So one of the best ones that are out there right now is The Injustice Never Leaves You by Mónica Muñoz Martinez. She gives a great account. We were both writing our books at the same time. So when I released the first Rinche book, we had a dual release for our books at that time. But I decided to do it this way for lots of different reasons. One is how do you get kids to want to be engaged with history? Well, and especially when I started to tell it in fiction, but also in a superhero story, right? And so this is kind of a side note, but this all started because there's the history of Batman that really comes about here. Most people don't think of Batman as connected to this. But the two writers who came up with Batman, which was Bob Kane and Bill Finger, wanted to write for Zorro, the Zorro comics. And Zorro is based off of a real Californian bandit or folk hero by the name of Joaquin Murrieta. And the first book written about him, he was the first literary superhero, was written, The Life and Times of Joaquin Murrieta by John Rolling Ridge, who was a Cherokee Indian. That was written in the 1850s. He was a newspaper man. So when we look at Joaquin Murrieta as the archetype for Zorro, the two writers wanted to do a Zorro type comic, so they created Batman. So Batman has always been Chicano. That's where that all comes from. And the actual literary history of heroes and superheroes is deeply entrenched in Mexican American history. And so this is one of the things. And so also the way that we preserved our history for a long time was through corridos, songs. And a lot of these guys, what they're considered bandits during this time, were preserved in song. Like the ballad is actually the corrido de Gregorio Cortés. And that's how it kind of preserved. That's how it kept the history going. We really weren't allowed to put it into books on threat of death. So I created this whole character. And also to the fact that there's very little representation of Latinos in the superhero world at all. We have one now, I think. Two, technically. Well, one's animated, which is Miles Morales, is Spider-Man, but he doesn't get a live-action movie. And then we have Blue Beetle. That's it, right? If you can think of any others, that'd be... but I mean, so I wanted to introduce the character, especially in a very dark time, to show that there was resistance. It wasn't just people being murdered, but there was people who resisted this. And so these books kind of do that, and they kind of tie together a lot of these different elements of resistance and resilience for the community. So I'm going to kind of end my whole thing here with a quote by Elie Wiesel. If you're not familiar with him, he wrote A Night, which is the Holocaust novel. And he always said that my life as a writer, or my life period, would not have become what it is, that of a witness who believes he has a moral obligation to try to prevent the enemy from enjoying one last victory by allowing his crimes to be erased from human memory. And so that's why he wrote, and that's why I write these, because these are crimes that occurred. So this picture right here is a picture of a massacre that occurred. And I don't know if you can read it, so it says 36 dead bandits. They used bandits, that was the term that they always used. In this picture, you see off to the left here, all those guys in white hats, those are Texas Rangers. The one guy in the black suit with his hat off here is J.T. Canales. J.T. Canales was the only Mexican-American legislature at the time. And what ends up happening is he's the one who brings the hearings against the actions of the Texas Rangers, and he puts them on trial. And this happens in 1919. And this trial transcript, so we'll talk about a bit later, is preserved now, but over 200 people testified about the atrocities of the Texas Rangers at these. And because of J.T. Canales' hearings, he was able to disband the Texas Rangers as they existed at the time. They reformed under the Department of Public Safety in 1935, but they were able to stop this era of violence, this reign of terror, from happening, and it's because he made this public in 1919. And so a lot of the stories that I've been researching, a lot of this is in these testimonies. And you can kind of find them online now. We've actually put them as PDFs online. You just type in J.T. Canales Texas Ranger hearings, PDF, and it'll pop up. And you can read all this for yourself. They're pretty horrific. All the people who testified, there was a ton of them. You know, daughters talking about how, 8-year-old girls talking about how their father was lynched and murdered in front of them. These little girls are up there testifying. That's courage. In a room full of white legislatures, right? And you know, to show you how bad it was, J.T. Canales, they would refer to him as the greaser from Brownsville. That's how he would get introduced on the floor of the Texas Senate. To give you an idea of the climate of what was happening in 1919. But this is kind of a very, very truncated history of everything, right? But what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of, with Dr. Limon, she's going to talk about, you know, we're going to start having a conversation about the books and everything and how this all plays out. All right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving us such a rich background. It's a lot of history, complex history. But before we get into the books, I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your personal story and approach. You start off talking about your grandfather. I know we have some students here who are budding archivists. Could you just talk a little bit about how do you negotiate the archive with the personal story? How do you hear the silences that are in that archive, and then we can get into how that informed your book.
Sure. So when I first started to do this research, there wasn't an archive. I'm just make that clear. When I first started looking into it, like when I first thought of the idea, I was like, oh, I need to write about this. I'm going to go look for the books. And I couldn't find anything, right? There's very few. And then there was James Sandos, who's the one that found the transcripts in '75. And then there was a couple of other people, but mostly this had not really been in the history books. It's almost been erased. So what I did is, at the time when, this is 12, 13 years ago now, my grandfather was already in his 90s and he had Alzheimer's. So getting the stories from him were going to be impossible at that time. So, but I just, what happens though is because I come from a line of with the Cavazos. So the Cavazos were one of the major families that lost their lands. That comes directly. So when I would go and start to talk to people, they would open up to me. And the first thing they would ask me when I would ask them to talk about this time is, who are your grandparents? Who's your family? Because one thing that they learned a lot, and even my grandmother would tell me this when I was young, you don't talk to Anglos about these stories. Because what happens after the Texas Rangers are quote unquote disbanded is they become the local law enforcement for the area. So there's a culture of silence. And so to be able to get people to open up about what happened, the atrocities that occurred, was very difficult for a lot of researchers. But because I'm a part of that community, they opened up and they told me a lot of their stories. So I basically ended up just recording and doing a lot of oral history work. And you know, others like Monica and others, we all started, this is the way our primary, like when we start to look at what's in the archive, there's not a lot. Besides Jovita Hidalgo's writings and a few others, we had to build this kind of on our own. And then of course, when the transcripts were finally made available, that is a huge treasure trove of information, firsthand information. But a lot of it is oral history work and trusting, and so this is a huge problem in the academic world, right? The mistrust of oral history work. But it's extremely important, especially when we're dealing with these subjects, because a lot of this stuff, a lot of the atrocities are not recorded and you know, in quote unquote the traditional historical sources. So this is why that becomes the so when you, I mean, doing work in anything dealing with this type of subject, you're gonna have to rely a lot on descendants, victims, but people who witnessed this, and oral history work. You gotta listen to their stories. Yeah, that's what I would say.
As somebody that does oral histories as well, it's a large responsibility, and it's both intellectually exhausting and physically exhausting sometimes to carry that story. And so when I was reading your books, I was thinking a lot about how that must have been a kind of cathartic release for you, in a way to be able to channel some of that energy that you receive from those oral histories into something else. For our audience or folks that maybe haven't had a chance to read the novels, could you give us a little synopsis of what they're about first?
Sure. So the novels themselves are a critique of the Lone Ranger stories. Because the Lone Ranger myth it actually has its own unique history that most people don't know. So the Lone Ranger character himself is actually modeled off someone named Bass Reeves, who was an African-American U.S. Marshal. So the story goes is that these two guys who were working for RKO Studios in the late 1920s, early 30s, were looking to write a story, and they wanted to write a Western. And across the street from them, because they were in Detroit, was a federal prison. And they went to interview the prisoners, and they all said, there's this one guy. And they're referring to Bass Reeves, who actually is actually the most successful lawman in U.S. history. He arrested over 1,400 people. And I actually read through all his biographies. He did, and all his records. And Bass Reeves, so when they really wanted to write this story about him, but they couldn't because it was a black man. So in the 1920s, that just wasn't going to fly, so they gave him a black mask. But all the details about the Lone Ranger is the life of Bass Reeves. Right now, I think on Paramount or CBS, there's a show called On Bass Reeves that just started, which is the first time he's ever really gotten recognition as how important of a figure he is. So when I learned that, that's when I started to, how are we going to challenge this? So I thought about it, and I created this character who was the son of a landowner at the beginning of this whole era, whose family is massacred, and he's left for dead, and he gets picked up by, and then Bass Reeves is in the book. Bass Reeves, and then a Native American character who kind of becomes his partner. And they decide to try to fight what's going on here, right? And so in the book, there are several incidents that are real historical incidents. So all the historical, like the lynching, the major lynching that happens in the middle of the story, that's a real lynching that occurred. The fights that they have, the battles, those are all real. The only thing is I put these kind of characters in there. But Bass Reeves was a real person, and he is in the books. So there's a lot of real people that end up in these books. But they kind of take on the superhero persona. So the main character is a light-skinned Mexicano with green eyes. And so what they do is they create this character of a ghost ranger. And the reason that they do it that way, as a friend of mine calls it, it's weaponizing whiteness. Because when they first start their journey, they try to do it as bandits. And what ends up happening is retaliation against the community, which is one of the climax in the first novel, which is when they realize that they're starting to lynch the community a lot more aggressively. So they create this character as a protection, so they think it's a white man. And so this is where this Rinche, that's why he's called the Rinche. So the community knows that he's not white, but nobody else does. And so they create this kind of mythical characters, and they end up taking on, the characters themselves end up becoming in these fights against what's happening at the time. So that's kind of the best synopsis. Each, like the first and the second novel, there's two of them. I just finished the third one, which should be coming out next year. And then there's a fourth one, which actually takes place during the J.T. Canales hearings. So it's kind of in the whole thing. And they take place around very key moments within this history. So the second book takes place about the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. And then the third book takes place in 1915. 1915 is a significant year because that was the bloodiest year there this time. And so all these, and of course 1919, which is the hearings that occur. So that's kind of a summary of what the books are doing. But there is a lot of mixture of characters, Japanese characters, African American, Native American characters. So a lot of people ask me why he has samurai swords. They're actually not samurai, they're ninja swords. So the Japanese had two major colonies in this area during this time. They were chased out of, this is real history. They were chased out of Japan in the 1880s. there was a massive war that occurred, which was the kind of the industrialization of Japan. And it was the fight. So if you've ever seen that movie, The Last Samurai, with Tom Cruise, everything minus Tom Cruise is what actually happened. It was the end of that feudal system, the shogun system, and the rising of the industrialized Japan. Well, a lot of people who fought on the other side ended up losing pretty badly, and they had death warrants for anybody who was around. So they were exiled. They had to flee as exiles, and or political exiles. And they came to the U.S. They first ended up in California, but the Chinese Exclusion Act kind of pushed them further east. And they ended up eventually in South Texas, where they settled there because I've talked to descendants of these Japanese families, that they were just more accepted by the Mexicans than they ever were by the white people. And so they kind of blended in, but they had 2 major colonies in this area, and they were also attacked by the Texas Rangers because they own lands. They owned their lands that they had. And so they become embroiled in this, and that allowed me to give them ninja powers. So, as a writer, but they actually did. The Japanese worked to train the Mexican soldiers in martial arts during the Mexican Revolution. They worked in munitions. They were very deeply ingrained. So this is like everything that seems fantastical is actually true about this history in these books.
Yeah, what I love so much is the solidarity in these like crass racial ethnic moments that I was not expecting when I first picked up the book. And you telling the history right now of the Japanese is a prime example of that. One of the things that fascinated me, and you mentioned briefly, is the role of the superhero, and your intention about how do you take this history and not only do a public history project, but really infuse it through YA literature. Could you talk to us a little bit about when you're thinking about how do we make this world a better place, what is the role of the superhero and what is the role of literature in telling this history?
Well, I mean, the primary thing, the way that most people learn history is through the arts. That's just the #1 way that people learn history. I mean, nowadays we have through TV shows and movies primarily, right? But novels still play a huge role. Graphic novels still play a huge role. But this is how most people get their history lessons. And of course, you got to take Hollywood to task for a lot of history because a lot of it's wrong. But to have representation is extremely important. And of course, we look at there's superhero movies all over the place, right? Especially for the last 10 years or so. But the hero has always been ingrained in American culture. You can go back to the Last Mohican novels, all those things. Those were singular heroes. They've always been a staple of American literature. And of course, with The Life and Time of Joaquin Murrieta, that is the first, really kind of superhero that was really featured in American literature. And of course, you get Zorro and all these that comes on later, but there's not. We look at the representation, and when I've even had done panels at Comic-Con, which is a very different audience. Trust me.
I know. Where are your costumes today? I'm so disappointed.
Those kids, I call them kids, but those people, they know every detail of the novels. They're so if you could get them to do that with regular books, but they're so invested in these characters. They're so invested in these stories, and I think it's extremely important to look for heroes in a time when it didn't seem like it's a very dark time. We're looking, especially the time that these novels are set in. We're looking at state-sanctioned violence. I can tell you stories that my grandfather told me about. One of the major things that happened during this time is that they were not allowed to bury their dead. They would not allow them to bury them, so they were left on the sides of the roads and things. And this was common. What would happen is the families would come at night and take the bodies and bury them privately. But this is the type of this is stuff my grandfather told me when I was 8 years old. He's drinking his Lone Star. He starts telling me all these stories about how they used to leave the bodies hanging from the light poles and all these things. I'm like, until the head popped off. This is what he would tell me. I'm like, but at the same time, there were people in there, people who fought back against this. And I think that's an important thing for when we talk about the importance of this, especially when we're looking at times that seem hopeless. Heroes are a symbol of hope. And so I think that's something that they grab. So that's one of the things I want to do is I just didn't want to write about this horrific time, but also, you know, there's some hope here, right? There's some resistance, there's some, you know, and so that's why, I mean, I think that that's one of the major things to do with literature and why it's important, and these stories are important.
Speaking of resistance, one of my favorite people, Jovididar, who you have in the book, a real person, you told us briefly about her. I can just imagine her standing there being like, don't take my press. She's been on the quarter. Could you talk to us more about her significance and maybe if there's any stories about her that we might not be familiar with that really speak to you in terms of that hope?
So Jovididar was a woman, she was from a very prominent Mexican-American family out of Laredo. The Haddad family was they were wealthy. They were in publications. They published a lot of newspapers. Her father, Clemente, was very, when I found and these different things is he said that I don't want you to marry until you've been educated. I want you to always have your own money and your own mind. This is 1900.
Very rare.
Yes. She didn't actually get married until she was in her 40s, I think. But he was very adamant that she be independent and that she be educated. And she was. She earned her teaching degree when she was 18 years old. She was deeply involved in writing and being a journalist. She was a huge advocate for education for Mexican-American kids. You know, first half of her life, she was down in South Texas, but then she moved to San Antonio for the second half of her life. And once she was in San Antonio, she was involved in a lot of the politics. And, you know, working with people like Emma Tanayuca, who was a major civil rights activist, and others. And what's interesting about her is she wasn't Catholic. She was a Methodist. Yeah, it's like in Texas.
A Mexican that's not Catholic in
Yes.
Texas? I didn't know there was any.
So and that's when I first started to do research on her. And you look at the Methodist faith. A lot of them is about social justice, and I just didn't know that. But yeah, so she was Methodist, and actually her grandniece is one of my students at the university I teach in. But her stories are interesting because her grandniece told me that when she would go to her house, she would have all her books, like all the Harvard editions of these great American novels. And then on the other side, she'd have all the editions of all these Mexican novels. So she was even like, she had them all separated, but she was saying like you'd look at it and she'd see her entire, she was a huge reader, but she always had it immaculate. She said you couldn't touch her books. But she was very much about bilingual education. And this is like 1920. So this is who she was, yes.
We're kind of more of a casual group here, so I also want to turn it to the audience. Otherwise, I have some more questions as well. Are there any audience questions as we're having this conversation?
Yes.
Oh, if you don't mind waiting for the mic for the folks on the Zoom, thank you.
It just very coincidentally, I was in Laredo this in February, right? And I'm just amazed because of this quarter, you know, I mean, I went to like the, you know, little museum that's down in the square, you know, by the hotel, you know, all of this sort of thing. I learned more about George Washington's birthday celebration.
Yes.
Right, that was everywhere, and this quarter was nowhere, despite the, I mean, anyway, you know, I just was curious if George Washington's birthday, I mean, what's that about?
Laredo is a very interesting space. So we had her quarter release in San Antonio. The city of Laredo really didn't want to do it. The city of Laredo is very conservative. I think there might be like a park named after her in Laredo, but they didn't really want anything to do with this. But San Antonio, you know, We had the massive, the U.S. Mint was there, Smithsonian, everybody was there, but it had to be in San Antonio. Well, she spent the second half of her life in San Antonio. But if you go there, right now they're working on naming a street after called Jovita Hidalgo. They're preserving her house. They created this huge mural for her in San Antonio. You're not going to see that in Laredo. I don't understand the George Washington thing. I'm not from Laredo, but but that thing has apparently gone on for like 100 years. I don't know. Then what I understand is there's no connection to George Washington and Laredo whatsoever. So it's one of those weird things. I have no idea what that's about. If anybody does, I would love to know. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a quick question. So I'm just interested in, because just thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. But what are some ways that this kind of like racial violence kind of continues today? Like you think of like the Operation Lone Star and things kind of taking place. Like, what are that aside with other? What are some other examples of like how this racial violence continues today?
Okay, so a lot of the stuff that we've been doing with Refusing to Forget has been expanding into current stuff. So one of the things that we get a lot is when the Texas Rangers get asked by reporters about the work in like the history of the Texas Rangers, their response is the current Texas Rangers are not associated with those Texas Rangers. So that in itself is an admission of guilt. I'm sorry, it is. But they try to distance themselves from that history. But the Texas Rangers were sent in to stop integration in the 1950s. They were sent in the 1960s to stop, Chicano activism, to stop basically the farm workers' strikes. So I don't know. But even until today, it's pretty. The Texas Rangers now we can kind of say they're like an investigative group. They're like a state investigative group. But Operation Lone Star, the whole thing with I don't know if you guys heard about Greg Abbott putting those razor wire buoys in the river, which is completely illegal because that's federal. It's actually international waters, right? That type of violence is still occurring today. Arizona, Arizona deserves its own talk, but they have a lot of these, especially when you look at Maricopa County and things of this nature. But even like the people who live there, like Mexican Americans and Mexicans are not really, there's not really a division the same way, right? And then I'll give you an example of something that happened pretty recently in history during the Trump administration, right? They had sent people down to the border to start to look at people's birth certificates. Because if you're born on the border, they want to try and validate those birth certificates. So even though that's not violence, like with somebody being hungry, but that is violence to get into community, to try to destabilize what's going on there. So these kind of tactics are still occurring. There's still, the shooting in Uvalde is one thing we've been involved in. It's not really like they were responsible because of their failure to act. And there's a lot of pressure on the Texas Rangers were involved in that thing as well. And the families are trying to hold the Department of Public Safety, all these people accountable because they waited an hour and 14 minutes before they intervene. And the guidelines for active shooter is 14 minutes, it has to be resolved. And they waited an hour and 14 minutes, and we lost 21 kids. So we're involved in these very different aspects of it, but there is a lot of this idea of protecting this kind of thing, and the police protection and all this, but there is violence. There's violence still in different ways. And of course, there's a lot of Latinos that are not as reported that are shot by cops. There's quite a few. That is very underreported. Throughout the country, for sure.
How do you make sense of follow-up? When we teach about the Texas Rangers in the 1910s and 20s, it's very racialized. We talk about the Anglo settler colonialism. Today, it's much more complicated. When you look at Border Patrol, there's a large Latino number of Border Patrol. I've been to San Antonio many times. I only saw brown cops. How do you make sense of this and the resistance work that you all are trying to do?
Well, a lot of one of the things we stopped at our university, Our Lady of the Lake, is that the border, when they have career days, the Border Patrol would petition to be part of Career Day. And our university is like 95% Mexican American kids, right? A large portion of those are undocumented. And so a lot of the Border Patrol like to go into these areas to recruit. And this actually goes into the military does this as well. They go into the barrios and all this place to heavily recruit because for a long time, I mean, my uncles, my dad, that was the only way out. That was the only way out to get out of these situations as you go into the military. Well, now the Border Patrol is promising these kids who have nothing. You're going to start off $60,000 a year, all this. So, and there's a lot of internalized racism and colonization because they don't know their histories. That's not being taught, right? So that's part of the educational work I do. Is the reason for this is to people know their histories so they can make informed decisions when they're, the military. They don't deny that they target these areas because this is where they're going to get their most recruits, and they know it. They're not going to target the richer areas.
Yeah, I mean, we have the racial admissions has been changed, but not for the military, right?
Yes.
For this very reason. I'm going to go to some of the questions here that we have for folks in the Zoom. This is something that you and I were talking about before we started, but could you talk to us a little bit if there's any movement to try to change the name of the Texas Rangers baseball team?
So the Texas Ranger baseball team, there is, but it's hard to get traction, especially in Texas. The Texas Rangers still today are basically a huge part of the myth of Texas, right? So it's a huge thing, and so that's hard to tackle. I mean, the Washington Redskin fight took 40 years before they were able to change their name. And of course, I think the Texas Rangers just won the pennant, so that's going to make it a little bit tougher. But I'll tell you this, because of the work we've done, there was a college, San Antonio College, who had their mascot was the Ranger, and the group of students, because they saw the work that we were doing, and they read my first book, they organized, and it took them about a year, but they were able to replace the Texas Ranger as their mascot, and now they're the Armadillos. So, so that kind of influence, it makes us very proud because this is the kind of thing where, once people know their history, they're able to start to affect change. I think that's why it's so important to get these stories out there.
Bianette?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your commitment to representation, especially as a mother of 2 teenagers who are, concerned about having representation, seeing it on TV, seeing it in pop culture. And so I wanted to know more about, like, you talked about how the kids come up to you, or the young adults come up to you at Comic-Con, and they talk about how they know your novels. And so I was wondering if you could share a few more stories of their reactions to your books.
So I was doing a talk at a high school in Brownsville. Brownsville is, if you're not familiar with it, most people know South Padre Island as like Brownsville is a city right there. It's one of the oldest cities in this country. It used to be Matamoros, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, so I was doing a talk there, and at the end of it, this kid comes up to me. So before I have to preface this though, during this time, there was several folk heroes. One of them was named Aniceto Pazania. Aniceto Pazania was noted for, he was a landowner that was attacked, and then they shot his son, and that's what spurred him on to become a revolutionary. So I had not written about him. He's in the second book, but he's not in the first book. And I was doing a presentation after the first book, and this kid comes up to me, and he asked me, "Have you ever heard of Aniceto Pazania?" I was like, "Yeah, of course." It's like, that was my great-great-grandfather. And so since that happened, he's the first one to go to college, to be going to college in his family. This family was rich. They had a ton of money. They were very well educated before the Matanza. And after that, they became farm workers, troqueros. And they were never able to, and so he told me he was the first one to go to college. And it says, because Aniceto Pazania had to flee to Mexico after this whole thing, that they're not allowed to bring him back to bury him in this country because he's considered an enemy of the state. But that kind of a story, when you hear that, this is the intergenerational trauma of what this event did to families. So hearing that story from that one little, I mean, he was just a high school kid, and he's like, I'm the first one to go to college from that time. That is, you know, for me, one of those moments I take with me. That's he was so happy that somebody was writing about his family history, and so I'll give you an idea of the kind of responses I get from the younger generations.
We have another question on Zoom to follow up about the kids or young people reading this. One of the questions asks if you edit the intensity of the violence for kids who might read this book, or do you keep it as told to you through history?
So one of the decisions I had to make as a writer, how do I write these lynching scenes? So one of the I've talked to lots of different people about this, but for me, I need to be respectful of the victims, and that is from I've heard from other writers. I'll say they're white writers who don't even think about that. They want the shock value, but for me, I can't, because these are my community, these are my family. So I have to like figure out how I'm going to do this and pay respect to these people that were murdered. So I don't try to you create like torture porn type stuff, right? I don't do that. I try to be as respectful as I can while being able to at the same time balance out telling what these real stories were. So it's something that I struggle with constantly, and I hope I was able to be able to portray it as honestly as possible. So that's the one thing I would say is, like, I think there's a responsibility as a writer and as someone who as a historian, that how we portray these stories, how we preserve the memory of these people that were killed.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of when I was reading it, I was also thinking of Ken Gonzalez Day's work. If you're not familiar with him, he's an interdisciplinary scholar. He documented Mexicans that were lynched in the West, but he also was a visual artist. And so what he would do is he would find these archives and he would remove the body. And so instead of seeing the spectacle of the lynched body, we then look at the spectacle of the people doing the lynching. And it's grotesque when you see these families, like it's a father-son moment to go, right? And we see the same thing in, of course, African-American history, Black history here in the country. Can you talk to us a little bit about this culture of censorship and trying to figure out how you negotiate? I appreciate what you were saying about honoring the victim, but there's also a level of really wanting to speak truth to power in an era when banned books are, again, on the rise. And of course, it's a small percentage of people we know that are attempting to ban books by queer writers and writers of color. But do you ever feel any pressure for that, or how do you negotiate the world of the banned book?
So I want to get on the banned book list. That would be so amazing to be with those authors.
We should just, I want to get a shirt that says ban my book,
Yes.
right?
Because what happens when you get on that list is your book sells a whole lot more. But the banned book list, what's going on there, and a lot of it is in, what they're doing right now, especially in Texas, is they're targeting the public library system, which is where I got my education as a kid. I think most people who grew up in poor communities, that's the space you went to. The public libraries is where you got access to all these books. And that's one of the, I think one of the greatest things that we look at in what the society, American society has provided, is the public library system. When I was young, my dad would take us there on like every Friday to get new books. He'd always take us to make sure that we were educated, that we had the access. So they're targeting the public library system, and which is, I think, is horrible. So a lot specifically, they're looking at queer writings, as well as anything that deals with sexuality, right? Which in American literature, there's a whole lot, right? In all literature, right? Even Shakespeare, there's a lot of that, right? But attacking that is attacking because when you start attacking the literature, the writings, you know, that's when you know that that's the first step, one of the first steps toward fascism, right? Start banning knowledge. Why are you afraid of knowledge, right? They're saying it's a parent's right. Well, my parents chose what I could read, you know, but they're making choices for other parents, right? This is what they're not telling you. It's like, well, When we talk about, like, there's a group called Moms for Liberty. I don't know if you ever heard of them. And in the state of Texas, when I go to the State Board of Education meetings, to give you an idea, the student population is 53% Latino students. 53%. That's a majority by math standards. It's not a majority in Texas. And actually, if you look at the students of color ratio in Texas, 73.5% students of color. That means there's only 22% white students. But the curriculum does not reflect that. So these Moms for Liberty, they say they're representing parents, but most of the parents are parents of color. And when they go to testify, the parents of color are testifying against Moms for Liberty. And so, like, so what is actually happening here? This is a political move, right? But the banning of books is the first step, right? I mean, we're looking at, why are you banning knowledge, right? If you truly believe in what you're saying, you should be accepting of all this knowledge, and then to get people to believe what you want to believe. But that's not how it works when you want to push an agenda. But the public library system is a target right now, and there's lawsuits that are challenging these they're trying to ban a lot of books in these public libraries right now. But I think it's a horrible thing.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have maybe like two questions. The first one is, how do we, I guess, deal with libraries in today's age when they're just like almost gone anyways, right? How do we keep access on the phone, to be serious, because that's what these kids are going to. And then, Florida has the exact same demographics where the K through 12 is well over 50%. I think it's at 70%. And so I'm just like, Florida's dealing with a similar problem. What do you think about Florida?
Florida. It's like Texas and Florida are always the two states that start stuff, right? Yes. So I think what you're seeing here is the demographic shift of power and the fight to maintain power. There's a great book by Carol Anderson called White Rage, if you ever read that. And she talks about every time there's these massive progressive changes, there's what she calls the white backlash, right? Because it's this realizing that they're losing their powers, and and there's like this desperate struggle to hold on to it. And so this is what you're seeing in a lot of these legislatures in Texas and others in Florida, is I think that they know that they have to know that it's going to be changing within the next 10, 20 years, that they've lost power. So they're going to struggle so much to hold on to this. And to erase someone's history again is the way to try to keep this kind of control, right? This kind of, it's a colonization project, right? That's still ongoing. But there's a lot of students of color out there. And what's interesting about Texas, it's schizophrenic, because we were able to get, just recently, Native American studies passed in our public school system. We have Mexican American studies, African American studies, and now Native American studies. They're approved. TEKS-based courses, was what BNN was talking about, are those state-approved courses. We have those approved, and we just got Native American approved. So this is like the State Board of Education, though. This is separate from the legislature. So separation of powers is a good thing. So we have this happening in Texas, where we're actually getting more ethnic studies courses passed for K through 12, but their attack on the colleges is pretty strong right now. Florida has kind of the same thing happening. They just don't report on that fact because these are two separate bodies, right? Most people don't know about their state boards of education. But those state boards of education control the education for all the K through 12 system in your state. Those, depending on the size of it, like we have 15 people that are the State Board of Education representatives in Texas, control all of the education in Texas. People should attend those meetings. People should pay a lot of attention to that, because that's where you affect a lot. That's how we were able to do it, right? To get these classes passed. Because since nobody really goes to these, there's not a lot of press, but every time we would go to testify, we would bring press. We put them on a pedestal, and so they would have to do, basically, when they're on, they're not used to being in the spotlight. And when they expose that, they end up going our way. A lot of public pressure, that's what helped to get these courses start to get passed. But so yeah, it's a crazy thing, but like the stuff you see on the national scale, what's going on the local levels is different. Oh, libraries? I think libraries are still extremely important, especially for poorer communities, because this is the only place where lots of people get access to computers, get access to books and newspapers and things. Those places are still extremely important. They're community centers for a lot of poor communities.
What about this computer?
No, I mean, that's true. We have the phone. But like I said, you're thinking about it, because I have a lot of students who don't have access, to even a phone. So they have to go somewhere to use a computer. Because we're thinking about this, we're thinking of actually first world problems, right? But there's a lot of people who live below the poverty line who don't have access to those type of things. Even though cell phones are a way to get there, access to what's on that, there's a lot of kids who get a lot of information off like TikTok and stuff, right? So you got to infiltrate there too. Yeah. But you got to infiltrate the social media spaces. But I think that public libraries are still very important, especially for the poorer communities.
And I would say rural too. I was in Farmington, and during COVID, what they did at the library for the first time nationally was that they have the library open when there's no one working there. And so you have a code to get in, and they couldn't staff it. It was during COVID and they were unsure, and it became so popular because they were able to keep it open until 11 o'clock. And so a lot of students or, folks that wanted to access these resources that couldn't because they were working multiple jobs had more time. Or there's some people, they open at 6 a.m. with the little punch code, were able to go very early before the librarian even got there. And so I think thinking of alternative structures for how to use the physical space will be really important. But I always tell my students, the librarians are your best friends. They're like the más chingona of all, because they really are radical in a lot of the work that they're doing. We have another question here from the audience.
My question was actually about the TEKS curriculum.
So it stands for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills.
Yeah, I'm from Texas,
okay.
So it was TEKS, I think, when I was in school. Yeah. But I was gonna ask about the work that you were doing on that.
Yeah.
I guess I had another question as well, which is kind of going back to the book and the history that you talked about, and moving away from this conversation a little. But I was really interested in what you were saying about how the Texas Rangers were legally sanctioned, and how that kind of violence was brought into the legal code through the governor. And I was kind of wondering about the lineage of that kind of legal precedent, and where you see that trajectory going.
So, when Trump said that whatever they would do, they would pardon them for the January 6th stuff, right? That's basically what the governor said. Like, whatever you do, I'll just pardon them. That in itself was, when we look at the Texas Rangers were originally instituted as a special branch of the governor's office. They were not bonded. And so most people don't know what that means, but bonded means that you're adherent to the city, county laws out there. And so, but the problem with the Texas Rangers is that they operate as a special branch of the governor's office. So the only person that could hold them accountable was the governor himself. And that was obviously changed after the J.T. Canales hearings, because that gives them unlimited, basically his own army in a lot of ways. It gives the governor his own army, which is a very dangerous thing to have. That was a thing that was actually implemented during the Texas Revolution, because at that point they thought they were going to be a country, right? So they had their own army. They tried to, but that's a whole other history, right? But a lot of people don't know about the Texas Revolution. It was actually fought over slavery. You're not going to hear that in Texas schools, but it's true because Mexico outlawed slavery. And then what happens right after that? Texas Revolution. Most of those who came in, all the Anglos that came in were Southerners, and they came in with slaves. And Santana told them, you have to free your slaves within a year or else. And they didn't listen, so he brought the army to make that happen. This is actually history. And the Texas Constitution that was written is the only constitution ever written that had slavery written into it. This is all documents you can look up online. So the Texas history doesn't want to talk about real original primary sources, but they were not afraid to be racist, right? They didn't care at the time. You look at the Confederacy, that says there why they did it. Nowadays, they're trying to say it's about states' rights and all this stuff. If you look at the primary sources, they were pretty clear what they were fighting for. They wanted slavery. Texas did too. So that's the whole thing. Yeah.
On that, following up on that, is there a push, like, I think I took like 6 years of Texas history in public education in Texas. So is there a push to integrate more, like from the groups that you work with, like other than just having these kind of ethnic studies classes that are optional, to kind of integrate that into more of the kind of mandated Texas history?
Oh, I would love to have that integrated into the general curriculum. It's so difficult. Getting into the general curriculum is tough. I mean, it's a long road ahead. The fact that we got these classes passed and accepted is a huge step forward. But yeah, that's a fight that we want. Because Texas history needs to be told that, first of all, Texas only existed for 7 years. Before that, it was Mexico. And before that, it was Spain. And before that, it was indigenous. And then after that, it became the U.S. So when we talk about Texas history, what do you mean? Like, are you talking about the native peoples that lived there? Are you talking about the Spanish? Are you talking about, like, that would be like most of the history of Texas. But when they talk about Texas history, they're talking about the Alamo and stuff, right? Which is the worst military move ever in history. And it's and all these guys were telling them, you got to leave, you're going to get massacred. Even like Sam Houston, I was like, you guys got to abandon that, that's stupid. And these are all letters, and they just didn't listen to him. And then they got massacred. It's the worst military move ever. But they used it, right? Now it's a huge thing, right?
They make movie after movie. Some of my students are here. We looked at the trailers.
The John Wayne one?
And also the latest one.
Oh my God, they're bad.
They're really bad with the music and yeah, it's patriotism. Any other questions we have from the audience? We have a little more time still.
I don't think.
Yes, one more. Yes.
Okay.
1 minute, please.
All right.
1 minute, please.
She's coming with the mic.
We have people that are doing captioning, so it helps for all the people on the Zoom. Thanks.
Yeah, so I know that you included the map earlier
Yes.
on like Cameron and Hidalgo County in terms of like who, kind of what the land grabs kind of look like. But is Refusing to Forget planning to kind of expand that kind of more into the Upper Valley and increasing?
Well, we're looking all around the country right now for these incidents. But the reason that those two counties are important is because that's where the majority of the violence took place.
Gotcha.
So we're looking at lands that Bailey had 50,000 people living there that ended up getting a third of their population massacred during this time. So, but there was concentrated on those two counties because those were the two major counties where they were trying to get the lands primarily. And that's why it becomes so concentrated in that area.
Gotcha.
But yeah, no, we look all over. I mean, we have stuff going on outside of El Paso, which is the Borderlands Massacre. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's a pretty famous one. They made a documentary about it on PBS where they basically lined up, all these men and boys and just shot them. The entire village was just decimated. There was a lynching that occurred outside of Uvalde in a little town called Rockport. It was actually one of the only lynchings that made it in the paper by Antonio Rodriguez. He was actually burned at the stake. And most people think lynchings are hangings, but they had all sorts of ways to lynch people. And that one actually made it into the newspaper, which is surprising, trust me, and an English language newspaper. But it's all over. I mean, most of it was there, but it was happening all over.
Great. Thank you.
Could you talk to us a little bit, and then we can go to a question up there, but could you talk to us a little bit about if your group is pushing for any type of reconciliation or reparations? I just am really struck by not only the generational trauma that remains, but also the loss of generational wealth, and if there's any talk about kind of redistributing some resources.
So there's the word that they don't like to use, reparations. Reparations, and most people don't really understand what that means. But it's really about, so reparations, yes. So the short answer to your question is yes. Right now, we're, Trinidad Gonzalez is heading up a whole campaign for truth and reconciliation in the state of Texas to recognize the state-sponsored violence, which is a long road ahead. So some of the political action we had, but reparations is part of that. Because there's still people fighting. Like I've seen, if you go to like some of these South Texas towns, you see lawyers advertising that they take on land grant cases now, like 2023, right? People are still fighting to get their lands back, right? And there was just a woman who won one not too long ago. She won a case, but you don't win your land back. They win like settlements, right? This is the difference. Like we're not gonna get our lands back. That's just, that's the same thing with indigenous, right? They're not expecting to get their lands back. They just need recognition that it was stolen, right? And then there's reparations in the form of, you got to pay us out, right?
Or in the land back movement,
Yes.
like actual saying decolonization is not a metaphor and
Yes.
to return lands. But I see in this case settlement makes sense.
A lot of them, because to get those lands back is difficult. But like we look at what happened with Alcatraz back in the 60s, right? Trying to reclaim those lands. So if you're not familiar with Alcatraz, it's when Native Americans occupied Alcatraz as federal lands, because it was actually native lands. And I forgot how long that lasted. It was a few months, I believe. And it kind of was the start of the whole American Indian movement.
Question up here, please.
Hello, and thank you again for sharing your work and gracing us with your presence this evening. I had a question about, like earlier when you talked about the individual who documented like many of these stories, and I was wondering, did you make any connections with Ida B. Wells?
Yes.
And then, you can answer that, and then I did want to know, as also a fellow oral historian, how did you make decisions to what were some of the decisions that you made as you were writing these novels of what to include of these oral histories and what not to include?
So it's tricky as a writer, because you have to service the story first and foremost. So like most of the research I did, probably like 10% of it ends up in the books, right? But I'll tell you this though, there's a lot of shared histories in these stories, because people think that history happens in some sort of weird vacuum where this happened to African Americans, this happened to Mexican Americans, and they didn't happen at the same time, and these groups never met for some reason, even though they're living in the same places. That's not how it happened, right? So when you're talking about Jovita Edad and Ida B. Wells, they actually met in Houston when she was doing a talk there, because they're both anti-lynching writers. So I actually looked for that too. I was like, did they ever meet? So I had to go find it, right? Because they're contemporaries at the same time. And she was very invested in what was going on, right? Like, especially with Ida B. Wells. And then, of course, it was an interesting thing because it was actually dealing with Marcus Garvey. So it was Marcus Garvey was there, Ida B. Wells was there. This is like 1916, I believe, in Houston. It's a very interesting, but Garveyism was massive back in those days, and Marcus Garvey was pretty big. So if you're not familiar with Marcus Garvey, you guys should know who Marcus Garvey was. But Bob Marley immortalizes him, so that's kind of your way in. See music, right?
And they're making a Bob Marley film. So yeah, the trailer looks good. I'm not holding my breath. We'll see how it goes. Well, that is our time. I just want to say it was such a pleasure talking to you. The public history that you all are doing is such pivotal work at this moment, and I wish you the best of luck, honestly, in continuing that fight, because it can be daunting, and perhaps it's my stereotype, but Texas seems really daunting to me to do that work. And for all of you, thank you so much for coming out. I definitely recommend picking up El Rinche, the series, for yourself or for some people in your life. You know, we talk a lot about representation, especially in the Latinx community when it comes to literature and it comes to media. We have a large buying power, but we are constantly underrepresented. But the only way that that changes is if we actually buy these books, support the artists. And so please put your hands together. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.